Contemporary history of Iran is a fascinating yet complex case study for scholars and enthusiasts due to frequent uprisings, revolts, and revolutions. There are heated debates on whether or not there is a continuity in Iranian history, one of which is the topic of today's special event. Good afternoon and welcome to İRAM's special event. My name is Ali Reza Hodai, and together with Başak Kilaci, we are your co-host for today's program. We are honored to host one of the most distinguished scholars of Iranian studies, Dr. Homa Katuzyan, and we will listen to his talk on one of the most debated articles in Iranian history, The Short-Term Society, a study of the problems of long-term political and economic development in Iran, published in 2004. But before we begin, I would like to invite Dr. Hakkı Uygur, Director of the Center for Iranian Studies, İRAM, for a brief introduction of the center and its activities. Hakkı hocam.
Thank you very much, Ali Reza. Hello and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to also welcome you to this special event and thank our distinguished guest, Dr. Katuzyan, and of course, our moderators, Ali Reza and Başak. The Center for Iranian Studies was established in 2016 in Ankara as the first research center focusing on Iran and its neighbors. With a young and dynamic body of experts, İRAM publishes reports, analysis, and opinion pieces on Iranian politics, economy, and culture in English, Turkish, and Persian. During the last 5 years, İRAM also has offered free and open to public intensive Persian language courses and multiple workshops that were attended by thousands of undergraduate and graduate students, journalists, and enthusiasts from Turkey. In line with our policy on conducting comprehensive research on a wide range of issues, we have also hosted many distinguished figures in the field of Iranian studies during the past 5 years. Today, İRAM is a respected center in Turkey with a well-established network of regional collaborations and a global outlook. Regardless of our efforts, understanding Iran is an important emerging power is not an easy task due to an eventful past and political polarization at the present. Only a handful of scholars had the courage to theorize on Iranian society, its past and its present, and there is no doubt that Dr. Homa Katuzyan is an important example of such scholars. Dr. Katuzyan's thesis on Iran as a short-term society has been widely discussed by scholars of the field and had a significant contribution to our understanding of the Iranian society. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Katuzyan for accepting our invitation, and without further ado, I will leave the discussion for our moderators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Homa Katuzyan, one of the leading scholars in the field of Iranian studies. I'm sure everyone in the field would know him, his publications and his contributions to the field very well, but for the others, I would like to make a brief introduction. Homa Katuzyan is a research fellow at St. Anthony's College and a member of Faculty of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford. After teaching and publishing in economics for long years, he devoted his whole time to Iranian studies. He was the legend editor of Iranian Studies Journal for 12 years. Under his editorship, the journal ran regularly and gained in prestige. He's currently editor of International Journal of Persian Literature and co-editor of Routledge book series in Iranian Studies. I would like to draw your attention to some features of Dr. Katuzyan's academic interest and works. Dr. Katuzyan is an expert on Iranian history, economy, as well as literature. This may sound unusual to some of us who see academia as an area of specialization divided into compartments and live in our own islands alone with very little interest in one another. However, Dr. Katuzyan has been teaching and publishing on Iranian history, politics, and literature for long years. Some of his works include on Qajar and Pahlavi histories, States and Society in Iran, the Eclipse of Qajars and the Rise of Pahlavis, Musaddiq and the Struggle for Power in Iran, and on Iranian economy, the political economy of modern Iran. And also on Iranian literature, study in law, and Sadık Hedayet, the life and legend of an Iranian writer. Secondly, Dr. Katouzyan wrote survey books covering the long periods of Iranian history, such as Iran, Politics, History and Literature, Iran, A Beginner's Guide, The Persians, Ancient, Medieval and Modern Iran. These books are not only reference books for the students and researchers working on Iran, but also guides for anyone who is interested in Iranian culture and history. And thirdly, Dr. Katouzyan put forward theories on the development of Iranian society and the relations of Iranian state and society. As you all know, his groundbreaking theory, Iran as a short-term society, is the topic of today's talk. And finally, a personal note, as being his research students for long years, I would like to say that he is one of the kindest and wisest person I have ever known. Now I'm leaving the ground to Dr. Huma Katouzyan. Yes, Ustad?
Is it my turn now?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much indeed, both of you, for your great introductions. And I regard it as a pleasure to be at your service today, speaking about the subjects that has been mentioned. I warn you that this is a comparative work, that is to say, a study in comparison of Iranian history and society and European history and society. So you will be hearing some of the things, as I say, about European history as well. Well, let me begin. I once wrote that up to a century ago, when an Iranian man left home in the morning, he would not know whether by the evening he would be made a minister or be hung, drawn, and quartered. I also wrote on another occasion that an Iranian may be a merchant this year, a minister next year, and a prisoner the year after. Obviously, these are exaggerations, but nevertheless, they are close to the Iranian experience throughout its long history. Ask an average Iranian what he would be doing in 6 months' time, and you would normally receive the reply, in 6 months' time, who is dead, who is alive? Iran was a short-term society in contrast to Europe's long-term society. It was a society in which change, even important and fundamental change, tended to be a short-term phenomenon. And this was precisely due to the absence of an established and inviolable legal framework which would guarantee long-term continuity. Over any short period of time, there were military, administrative, and property-owning classes, but often their composition did not remain the same beyond a couple of generations, unlike in traditional European aristocracy, even merchant class. In Iran, property and social positions were short-term precisely because they were regarded as personal privileges rather than inherited and inviolable rights. The situation of those who possessed rank and property, except in very rare examples, was not the result of long-term inheritance, say, beyond 2 generations before, and they did not expect the heirs to continue in the same positions as a matter of course. The heirs could do so only if they managed to establish themselves on their own merits. Merits being the personal traits necessary for success within the given social context. There thus was a high degree of social mobility, unthinkable in medieval and much of the modern European history. This did not exclude the position of the Shah himself, since legitimacy and the right of succession were nearly always subject to serious challenge, even rebellion. This did not exclude the position of the Shah himself. As I said, the most visible example of the short-term nature of Iranian society is the habit of declaring a building, especially in a residential building, a pickaxe building, ساختمان کلنگی. Most of these buildings are not no more than 30 or even 20 years old, and they are normally sound in foundation and structure. In a few cases, they may be run down and in need of renovation, but the future that results in their condemnation as such, and incidentally wipes off the value of the structure and only leaves the price of their site, is that their architecture and or interior design is unfashionable according to the latest forms, concepts, or whims. Therefore, rather than building a new house or whatever, these thus adding to the stock of existing physical capital, it is demolished by the owner or purchaser, and a new building is erected on its site. Hence, my description of the short-term Iranian society alternatively as the pickaxe society. The society where many of its aspects, political, social, educational, literary, are constantly in danger of receiving the pickaxe treatment because of short-term whims of fashion. Lack of long-term continuity by definition resulted in significant change from one short term to another. But that history, such that history became a series of connected short runs. In this sense, therefore, change was more frequent, usually also more drastic, and as noted, social mobility across various classes considerably higher than in traditional European societies. But also by definition, it rendered very difficult cumulative change in the long term, including the long-term accumulation of property, wealth, capital, social and private institutions, even the institutions of learning. These did normally proceed or exist in every short term, but they had to be reconstructed or drastically altered in the following short terms. Evidence of the short-term nature of the society as described above is to be found virtually in all of its aspects almost throughout Iran's long history, both pre-Islamic and post-Islamic. Here, we shall present a brief analysis of three of its main features closely related to one another. One, problems of legitimacy and succession, and the toll that this took of rulers, other royal persons, ministers, and military commanders. The tenuous, number two, the tenuous nature of life and possessions, John Omar. And three, problems of accumulation and development. Now I come to problems of legitimacy and succession. The untestability of the criteria of legitimacy and succession and the toll this took of rulers, other royal persons, ministers, and military commanders was a major feature of the short-term society. Both in the feudal states of Europe and in the absolutist states which succeeded them through and after the Renaissance, the rules of legitimacy and of succession were normally secure and inviolable. Primogeniture was the principal rule that in both the late feudal and the absolutist or despotic state governed succession, a rule which was also firmly enforced in the case of landed estates. The dukes or earls first in line was as firmly entitled to inherit his wealth and title as was the king's first in line. The first in line in both cases would be the first son or the nearest surviving male relative, although since Mary Queen of Scots in the 16th century, there were a few female monarchs in the absence of a clear and convincing male heir apparent. James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, was the legitimate successor to Elizabeth I through a distant and complicated relationship, which nonetheless made him first in line to the English throne. It is important to emphasize that, strictly speaking, neither the king nor aristocrats could have any say over the rules of succession. And this was not surprising, since the survival of manorial feudal estate ownership depended on it and on the law of entail. And since, unlike the merchant classes, it was extremely difficult for those of non-aristocratic descent to be selected to its membership, and impossible for any king to be such. Even in the odd case of Poland, where the habit grew of electing a king, the election was made only from royal or all aristocratic families. In the early 1570s, they elected Henry, Duke of Anjou, first in line to the French throne, who, having barely arrived in Warsaw, returned to Paris as Henry III upon the untimely death of his brother, Charles IX. Thus, royal succession, according to established procedures, was the most basic requirement for the king's legitimacy, and not only in the feudal period, but also under the absolutist state, which governed Europe for a maximum of 4 centuries, 1500 to 1900, for the continent taken as a whole. The power of the established church was less after the Reformation than before, and even in Catholic Latin countries. Still, it was one of the pillars of legitimacy for the absolutist government. Indeed, the countries like Spain, Austria, France, and England, which, unlike most of Germany, the Low Countries, and Switzerland, were united under a single monarch, the existence of an established as well as episcopal church was seen as necessary for the strength of the king's authority. James I, who ruled a fundamentally Protestant country, and besides fancied himself as a theorist of pure despotic rule, was at the same time fond of saying, "No bishop, no king." Now, it is important to note that while the principle of no bishop, no king emphasizes the usefulness of an established, indeed episcopal church for the king's power and authority, at the same time it clearly shows his formal dependency on a class of people outside of himself. The aristocracy provided the other main pillar for the king's authority, once again, as in the feudal period, but at a reduced scale. The merchant or bourgeois classes were by now another principal social base for the state, such that in the early Renaissance period, the state used their support to reduce the aristocratic magnates, perhaps the biggest single example of this being the triumph in the 15th century of Louis XI over the so-called League of the Public Good, led by Charles the Bold of Burgundy. Yet not long afterwards, the aristocracy and gentry became once again the state's principal social base next to the church, which jointly underpinned the legitimacy of absolutist rule. It would be quite reasonable to argue that Charles Stuart's greatest misfortune was that both of these two pillars of the state were divided in their attitude towards him, at least until his trial and execution in January 1649. It was in the same decade, that upon the death of Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, one after the other, the rebellion of some of France's grandest aristocrats, as well as the judicial authorities of Paris, known as Paris Parlement, in the 2 successive fronts, caused great disruptions for the rule of the very young Louis XIV and his regent and minister, Queen Anne and Cardinal Mazarin. In Iran, however, there was no law or entrenched tradition which would make succession predictable and or legitimate before the event. The most fundamental rule for succession and legitimacy was not primogeniture, although being a son or relative of the ruler was helpful. It was possession of farle-i-zadi, divine effulgence or God's grace. Anyone in possession of the grace would have the right to succeed or accede to the throne, and his rule would be therefore be regarded as legitimate. The theory or myth of the grace and the consequences of its possession and loss in practice are spread virtually all over Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, including the purely mythological, the heroic or epic, and the historical parts of the poem. Significantly, the grace takes a physical form on one occasion, and perhaps even more significantly, this occurs in the book's historical part, the story of Ardashir, son of Babak, descendant of Sasan and founder of the Sasanian Empire. When Ardashir is running away, from the last Arshakid Emperor Erdogan, and is being chased by him. The latter reaches a town through which the former has passed. He asks if Ardashir had been seen there, and is told that they had seen a ram galloping after a rider, more beautiful than a fabulous picture. The same story is told more elaborately in the Pahlavi text, Karnamak al-Taqshid al-Babakan. The relief at Naqsh Rostam shows Ardashir receiving the grace of Far from Ahura Mazda in the form of a diadem. Both man and God are shown mounted on horseback, while Ardashir is being invested with the grace. All this shows the supernatural as well as mythological nature of the grace. It is clear then, A, that the grace and its possession is a gift of God which carries paranormal or mysterious qualities, and B, that it is the crucial and fundamental test for succession and legitimacy over and above any other, including primogeniture or indeed royal descent. The problem, however, is that whereas in a mythological world, supernatural feats may be performed or tests conducted to determine the claimant's legitimacy, in the world of reality, there will not be any public test for it. A test that is, which, like primogeniture, may be observed commonly by all concerned. The last observation is absolutely crucial. The legitimate ruler was one who was anointed by God to act as his vicegerent on earth. Two fundamental differences emerged between the divine grace theory and the European rule of primogeniture. First, that in the real world, there cannot be an objective test of legitimate succession and rule. Or in other words, this was possible to know merely by virtue of the fact that the pretender or claimant succeeded and maintained power. Primogeniture unambiguously conferred legitimacy to the first in line to the throne, a rule that the king, or for that matter, the feudal lord himself, did not have the power to contradict. The second fundamental difference between the two traditions follows directly from the first. since Iranian succession and legitimacy were entirely determined by a divine gift which almost anyone could be deemed to possess by virtue of attaining power and maintaining it, he was in no way bound by any entrenched tradition or written or unwritten legal framework. And ipso facto, he was not dependent on the consent other than enforced submission of any part of the society, whether high or low, which is contrary to various European traditions from the classical through medieval to modern and contemporary times. Plainly, it appears from the evidence that the real test of holding the fire of grace was success itself, i.e., the fact that the ruler actually held and maintained supreme power. For apart from the mythological examples of Ardashir carrying the ram, the symbol of Farahi, or on horseback, or Feridun and Keikawush riding through wide and turbulent rivers, or the latter's father Siavash riding through fire, it is clear that the holding of the fire was recognized ex post facto, i.e. by the rule of post hoc ergo propter. In a real world, he had the fire that was and was therefore legitimate as ruler, who was actually in power and ruled effectively. The position resembles some recent theories that the wali or leader in an Islamic state emerges as a manifestation of the will of God and would therefore lose authority and or fall by the divine will alone, the society or people or any of their parts not having any say in the matter. This view was explicitly discarded in the Islamic Republic of Iran in the 1990s, but has resurfaced since 2005. This had a dialectical effect on the position of the ruler. On the one hand, and contrary to the position even of the absolute rulers of Europe, he was not bound by any earthly law, tradition, or restraint, and could exercise authority at will to the limits of his actual physical power, which for prudent rulers included consideration of limits to which the society would tolerate their actions. On the other hand, he almost constantly faced the fear of palace coups and potential rebellions, and he would never know with a reasonable degree of probability who would succeed him after his death. Because, unlike in Europe, virtually all that potential rebels needed for taking power with at least as much legitimacy as him was to succeed. In fact, the legitimacy of the successful rebel was nearly always greater at first than that of the fallen ruler, since, for reasons arising from these and other features of arbitrary rule, Iranian society normally disliked its rulers and wished them to be replaced by one who was less unjust or more just. Predictably, arbitrary state and arbitrary society, unaccountable government and ungovernable society were two sides of the same coin. That was another principal dialectic of the Iranian society. The myth of God's vicegerency of the ruler was not limited to the ancient pre-Islamic times. The term far itself was also used to confirm the divine legitimacy of post-Islamic rulers. Ferdowsi, for example, applies the term to Mahmud of Ghazna and his rule in a number of prefatory verses to various books of Shahnameh. No doubt Islamic concepts and theories of legitimate worldly authority emerged from the Quran, various bodies of tradition, and the theological and jurisprudential arguments and decisions based upon them. The comparison here made refers simply to the practical implications of the pre-Islamic and post-Islamic concepts, not their strict religious or metaphysical origins. Just as the Sultanate and even more so Caliphate were concepts that emerged and were justified on the basis of the Islamic doctrine and tradition, but that nonetheless it would be difficult to deny their practical resemblance, sometimes down to small detail, to pre-Islamic Persian traditions. The problem of succession persisted down to the 19th century. Fath Ali Shah chose his grandson Muhammad Mirza as his successor after the premature death of his son Abbas Mirza, the Prince Regent, and Muhammad's father. Yet some of Muhammad's uncles rebelled against him when he succeeded to the throne, and a couple of them were killed or blinded by the order of their brother, the Shah. That included some of his nephews as well. Later, Muhammad Shah himself was known to favor his younger son Abbas Mirza in preference to his elder son Nasruddin, the heir apparent. When the latter managed to succeed his father, the 9-year-old Abbas Mirza would have lost his life or been blinded if foreign envoys and Amir Kabir had not intervened on his behalf. But his court was looted on official orders, and later he spent much of his life as a refugee in Mesopotamia and Russia. Permission for him to go to Mesopotamia as an exile was obtained as a result of persistent interventions of both the British and Russian ministers in Tehran to stop him from being killed at the age of 13 by his brother, the Shah, on the mere supposition that he might be regarded as their alternative candidate for the throne by some unknown imagined intriguers. The correspondence between the two foreign envoys and the chief minister makes fascinating reading. At one stage, when the British minister wrote that they should not sacrifice fairness to mere imagination, that there is a plot centered around the boy, the chief minister revealed the logic of arbitrary justice by pointing out that in that country, one should act on mere supposition, or otherwise he may end up by losing the game. And this was obviously so precisely because legitimacy always belonged to the winner. He wrote that he had reported the British minister's letter to the Shah. The Shah had agreed with the minister that he meant well, but had added that, and I quote, "Your Excellency must pay attention to those peculiar Iranian customs and traditions and realize that in Iran, the things that Your Excellency has in mind will not work, and one cannot be immune from the evil intent of seditious and rebellious people. If the leaders of the Iranian state wish to act on the basis of fairness and justice to maintain order and security for all their subjects, they will have no choice but at the slightest thought, imagination, or supposition of rebellion, irrespective of who it might be, to try to put it down forthwith and not to hesitate even for a moment." Unquote. At any rate, the problem of royal succession eventually came to an end as a result of great power guarantees of the succession of the heir designate to the throne. Yet it is extremely instructive that Nasruddin Shah, who was by no means the worst example of an arbitrary ruler of Iran, almost withdrew the right of succession from his son and heir designate, Muzaffaruddin Mirza, and sold it to his other son, Zildus Sultan. He wrote to the former that the latter had offered him roughly 1 million tumans for the position. Zil was well known both for his shrewdness and lack of scruples. Muzaffar was lucky, therefore, that in reply to the Shah, his father, his able secretary, Amir Nizam Garousi, warned that Zil might well spend another 5 million for the Shah's position himself. There could be no better evidence at any rate for the unpredictability of succession in Iranian history that not much long ago, not much longer than 120, 30 years ago, it looked quite normal for the Shah to sell the succession for money. Legitimacy and succession being so much determined by mere success, by the mere fact of gaining and holding power by virtually anyone, it is not surprising that there was so much filicide, fratricide, and parricide within the royal household. Apart from the outright killing, the blinding and or permanent incarceration of princes within the women's compound or haram was a favorite Safavid device. It was from the haram that Shah Safi emerged to claim the throne of his grandfather Abbas I and ruled with exemplary cruelty. And it would not take much imagination to think of the magnitude of insecurity in which ministers, chieftains, and magnates lived and worked and sometimes died. The familiar story from the ancient to modern times of the long line of such powerful persons who, alone or together with their family and clan, perished on the order of the rulers, told in detail, would fill several volumes of chilling history. A few relatively recent cases, and in particular the case of Amir Kabir, are well known. But like so many other features of arbitrary rule and state and society, this too was structural and systemic, running from the fall and execution of Abul Fazl Balami, Abul Fath Busti, Abul Abbas Esfarayani, over 1,000 years ago, through Hassanak Wazir, Amidul Mulk Kunduri, Nizam Mulk Tusi, Shamsuddin Jovaini, Haj Ibrahim Kalantar, and Qam Maqam, to Abdul Hussein Teymurtash, Sardar Asad, and Firuz Mirza Nasruddin in the 20th century. All told, the list would probably run into thousands. Now I come to the tenuous nature of life and possessions. This feature of Iran's short-term society followed directly from the first. The ruler being God's vicegerent on earth and in no way answerable to anyone or any social class, however high by virtue of descent, position, or money, he had complete dominion over the life and property of all his subjects or flock, Rayyat. It followed that in the final analysis, no person or class of people was able to claim any rights except that which was bestowed or reaffirmed by the ruler. And what was bestowed by a ruler could be taken away by him or his successors, so long as they had the power to enforce their will. It follows that there would not be any legal code or procedure that might limit the power of the state or be invoked against its transgressions. This is the simple reason why there was not and there would not be private property in Iran in any sense that conveys from the history of it. Khasse, Khalese, and Diwani lands were directly or indirectly owned by the ruler and state. The revenue assignment systems also varied among themselves and within each category through time. Both Fleur and Lambton before him point out that even in the same, point out that point out that even in the same period, land and that belonged to the state could be transferred to the personal properties of the ruler. Frequently, there were different types of each of the categories at one and the same time. This itself is evidence of title, etc. The most important aspect of the system, if this be the appropriate term, was that those who held land or enjoyed its revenue one way or another had no independent right to it. It was a privilege rather than a right, which the state, i.e. the ruler or the local governor backed by him, could take away from him at will, so long as they had the physical power to carry it out. Fleur refers to the adage, all that a slave owns belongs to his master, as the logical explanation for such confiscation. Another version of that Arabic adage is, the slave and all that he owns belongs to the master. This is a more appropriate version because, as we shall see below, not only the property, but also the person of a subject, however high, was ultimately at the disposal of the ruler or of those who acted within his authority. Since government was not based in law, power, possession, and life itself could be taken away at short notice and without any formal procedures. The structure of insecurity ran through all orders of society, from the village headman to the local craftsman, the merchant and trader, to the state's agents, the governor and the governor general, the Mustafi, the Wazir, and not least the Shah himself. The primary sources of Iranian history are packed with innumerable examples of acute insecurity of not only property, but also life itself. As already noted, countless wazirs and other high officials of the state were killed or otherwise destroyed, and or their entire property was confiscated without any legal procedure and leave to appeal. But the plunder of the notables' property did not happen only when they fell from office and grace. It could happen at any time. 1,000 years ago, Master Secretary Bunasr Moshkan was a very important and highly respected high official of the state under both Mahmud and Mas'ud of Ghazni. He was also very fortunate to die in bed. Bayhaqi, the great historian, who wrote his history several centuries before the Safavids, relates that shortly before Bunasr died, the Sultan, prompted by a lesser official, had demanded a number of horses and camels from each of the Persian notables, including Bunasr. Even one of them, every one of them humbly complied. But Bunasr lost his equanimity, says Bayhaqi, solely because he thought that that lesser official had aimed his scheme at him personally. He sent a list of everything he possessed to the ruler, saying that he had earned them all in his long service to the state, and they were all there for Mas'ud to take and grant him an abode in a prison citadel. The Sultan was angry but decided to overlook the matter and drop the demand in Bunasr's case. Shortly afterwards, the latter died, and Bayhaqi says, and they told all sorts of tales about the causes of his death, which I shall not mention. Unquote. At any rate, he was mourned in honor. Nevertheless, all of his possessions were transferred to the state, and it is clear from Bayhaqi's text that this was normal practice. I quote, and they took his good, well-trained slave boys to the Sultan's compound and put the Sultan's brand on his horses and camels. And a treasury official was told to draw up a list of whatever the man had for the treasury, unquote. The example is important for some fairly obvious reasons, but most important of all because it shows that the appropriation of the estate of a man such as Bonas, even though he had died in honor, was normal practice. There are countless examples of official requisition in Iranian history, showing that a man's property, dead or alive, was always in danger of confiscation, in part or as a whole, even if he had not incurred the wrath of the Shah or whoever could exercise arbitrary power over him. Here are a few examples from the 19th century. In fact, all except the first one from late 19th century, when many leaders of state and society, including at times the Shah himself, were convinced that the country's salvation was in establishing orderly, responsible, and lawful government. After the death in office under Muhammad Shah of Manusher Khan Gorji, Mu'tamad al-Dawleh, the very powerful Governor General of Isfahan, his estate was confiscated by the state and his body was buried in Qom in his own special tomb. Asif al-Dawleh, one-time governor of Khorasan, who because of a major rebellion against his injustices had been withdrawn from his post, appeared to have gone mad. He had a large fortune, and rumor had it that he was pretending to be mad for fear that Nasruddin Shah would take his wealth from him. When he died, Amin Sultan, the Grand Vizier, had his personal treasuries sealed off on the Shah's orders. Eventually, they got a total of 150,000 tomans from his heirs. Mustafa Khan Amir Tuman, governor of Ardabil and Khoy, died. The Shah expressed much regret. I have subsequently heard that he sent a man to seal off his house because they say he has a lot of money. Yahya Khan Haji Nuri had endowed most of his property for fear that the Shah would take them after his death. Mehdi Khan was an official who had amassed a large fortune. When he died, the Shah had his house sealed off and took a large amount of his wealth. Kamran Mirza, the Shah's third son and Minister of War, jailed the wife of a commander of artillery after his death to obtain money from her. She refused to pay 70,000 tomans, and he eventually accepted 3,000. Having heard this, Nizam al-Dawleh, who was then the richest commander in the army, endowed the whole of his property. On the eve of the constitutional revolution, Mirza Mahmud Khan Hakim al-Mulk, Muzaffar al-Din Shah's long-standing physician and favorite, and recently minister of the royal court, who was hated by Amin al-Sultan, the Grand Vizier and Chancellor, died as governor of Gilan. He was believed to have amassed a fortune in the region of $2.5 million. Rumors were rife that he had been poisoned. His entire fortune was sealed off on the orders of Amin al-Sultan. Once again, it is important to bear in mind the logic of the system, for according to Mughal Sultanate, since much of the riches amassed by state officials was themselves due to confiscation of their property by the state was not viewed as an extraordinary violation of their rights. These are just a few examples of plunder of property when the victim had not fallen from office or grace and was not an object of wrath by the ruler. There are examples of cases when the ruler demanded money from an otherwise innocent notable. But there were other occasions when the ruler traded the life of an innocent notable or official for money. Innocent here meaning that the ruler himself did not have the slightest anger or grudge against the notable. Rawandi says that Sultan Mahmud Sultan Muhammad of the Seljuks was a good-natured ruler, but he had a great love for accumulating riches. His Wazir Zia-ul-Mulk had offered him 500,000 dinars to put a very important man who was also a Sayyid at his disposal, and the Sultan had agreed. Having got wind of the matter in time, the Sayyid quickly saw the Sultan and offered 800,000 dinars for him to put Zia-ul-Mulk at his disposal instead. This is how he made his bargain. He told the Sultan, I quote, I have heard that Zia-ul-Mulk has bought this slave of yours for 500,000 dinars. I wish that the Lord of the universe shall not see fit to sell this descendant of the Prophet. I should raise the 500,000 dinars to 800,000 on the condition that you would put him at my disposal, unquote. Ravandi comments, the love of money proved stronger to the Sultan than the preservation of the Wazir. He agreed to the offer and delivered the Wazir to the Sayyid, who rightly took his revenge from him, and he suffered everything he had thought of doing to amuse the Sayyid, unquote. That was 900 years ago. Now, at the close of the 19th century, Rukn-ud-Dawla, a brother of the Shah and Governor General of the Fars province, bore a deep grudge against Qawam-ul-Mulk, the biggest landlord and most important magnate in the province, and had the soles of his feet beaten by sticks and him thrown into jail. He then offered 100,000 tomans to the Shah and 30,000 tomans to the Grand Wazir Amin al-Sultan to sell Qawam-ul-Mulk to him. I'timad al-Sultaneh writes in his diaries, after entering Shiraz, Rukn-ud-Dawla had Qawam-ul-Mulk bastinadoed and imprisoned, and then written a letter to Tehran saying that he would pay 100,000 tomans to the Shah and 30,000 to Amin al-Sultan to sell Qawam to him. That is, for him to have the life and property of Qawam at his disposal. But he did not manage to buy Qawam, since he is a nephew of Sahib Diwan, and apart from that, this is not like the age of Fatih Ali Shah to be possible to buy and sell magnets and notables. The Europeans would make a fuss. He did not manage to buy Qawam, unquote. This happened in the late 1880s. The reference to the sale of important people by Fatih Ali Shah is not spurious, for Amin al-Dawla writes in his memoirs quite independently, I quote, Fatih Ali Shah even used to sell the court officials and state dignitaries to each other, since, as Iranian sycophants keep repeating, life and private possessions were the rightful property of the Shah and Shah. But as the above example from Seljuk period shows, this was by no means a Qajar invention. In fact, such things had been part of the country's social structure, and it is difficult to believe that they had not been practiced for any length of time. For that reason, it would be a mistake to attribute them to moral dejection, the moral dejection of rulers like these, governors or whoever. No doubt some of these were less kind or more greedy than the others, but the matter was deep-seated and systemic. It is succinctly captured by the adage, the slave and all that he owns belong to the master. Now I come to the last category, problems of accumulation and development. If there is one point in which all the major theories of economic development are agreed, it is that the industrial revolution occurred as a result of long-term accumulation of first commercial, then industrial capital. Without it, the necessary investment would have to take place neither in the commercial sphere, resulting in the unification of the internal markets and virtually continuous expansion of foreign trade, nor in the goods which make the innovation and application of modern techniques and processes possible in agriculture and industry. The simple but highly acute point about the necessity of long-term accumulation of capital was discovered by early classical economists, who observed that in order for a firm to expand, it needed to accumulate. And in order for it to accumulate, it had to save first. This was what they sometimes described as the process of plowing back capital. Turgot described the process more clearly than anyone before him, but it was Adam Smith who put forward a memorable argument for the necessity of prior saving for the expansion of the firm and hence the industry and therefore the whole economy. He said with a certainty uncharacteristic of his even-tempered approach to most matters of Syrian policy, that it was not so much technical progress, but saving and investment, making its innovation and application possible. That was the principal cause of industrial development. He therefore concluded that every saver was a friend and every spender an enemy of the society. Thus, he wrote in Book 2 of his renowned treatise, I quote, "Whatever a person saves from his revenue, he adds to his capital. And as the capital of an individual can be increased only by what he saves from his annual revenue or his annual gains, so the capital of the society, which is the same with that of the individuals who compose it, can be increased in the same manner." Unquote. In other words, aggregate saving is the sum of the savings of all firms and individuals. Furthermore, he said it's saving, not production, which is the initial cause of investment, of capital accumulation. I quote, "Parsimony, not industry, is the immediate cause of the increase in capital. Industry indeed provides the subject which parsimony accumulates, but whatever industry might require, if parsimony did not save and store up, the capital would never be the greater." Unquote. It follows that savers compensate for the habits of the spendthrift in preventing economic decline. Savers, therefore, help the society while spendthrifts hinder it. I quote, "If the prodigality of some was not compensated by the frugality of others, the conduct of every prodigal tends not only to beggar himself, but to impoverish his country. Every prodigal appears to be a public enemy, and every frugal man a public benefactor." Later, Malthus, Marx, Hobson, Tugan, Baranovsky, and Keynes, using different approaches and putting forward more or less strong arguments, showed that this theory was valid so long as aggregate demand would match aggregate supply at full employment in general, and in particular, so long as money is not hoarded. That is, so long as saving does not remain passive and idle, but is turned into investment by the saver or others who borrow from him. Yet the Keynesian criticism was so successful in the practice that in the practice of economic macroeconomic policy, virtually all distinction between investment expenditure and consumption expenditure ceased. This had disastrous consequences for certainly the British economy between 1950 and 1980, when not only new investment, but even renewal of stock was neglected, so long as aggregate consumption was adequate to maintain full employment. Indeed, Keynes himself might have said, and Keynes conquered England as completely as the Holy Inquisition conquered Spain. There can be no doubt that long-term economic growth and development would require a significant rate of saving and investment, from domestic or foreign sources, even for developed industrial societies. However, to save continuously and at a significant rate would be rational only in a social framework where there was no endemic fear of plunder and confiscation. Even in Europe, long-term capital accumulation was greatly encouraged first by the emergence of free towns such as bourgs, which afforded protection from feudal encroachments, and second by the rise of the Renaissance and absolutist monarchies with the full blessing of the commercial and middle classes, which gave them protection vis-à-vis the great aristocratic magnates. It was the accumulation of financial capital which made possible the financing of technical innovation, and through time, this led to modern technological development and industrial expansion. That is what used to be generally known as the Industrial Revolution. There used to be a puzzle posed by classical economists and later economic historians and sociologists and development economists, to which apparently no solution satisfactory to themselves and others has been offered. It was this: why did the process of capital accumulation not begin in societies like Iran in the rich and technologically advanced times, say in the early medieval period? The clearest answer to that question is that it was not safe to engage in long-term saving for fear of plunder and confiscation, and that in a small number of cases, small number of cases where such attempts were made, or for other reasons, a very large fortune was amassed. Later plunder and confiscation put an end to the process. Max Weber's solution to that old puzzle was that the other non-accumulating societies lacked something corresponding to Protestant ethics. Weber's theory of the crucial role played by these ethics in shaping the spirit of capitalism in Europe is intelligent, though it has also been subjected to serious criticism. Notwithstanding that, the question in the context of our inquiry is whether such ethics could have become widespread in societies where, at least in practice, there was no right of long-term property ownership. And if they did, and even lasted for reasons which are difficult to envisage, they would have resulted in long-term accumulation of capital. Even if significant, yes, for even if significant saving had taken place in the highly discouraging circumstances, it would not have resulted in long-term accumulation when it was perennially plundered. There can be little doubt that Protestantism, and especially its more radical sects, actively encouraged frugality and hard work, even in spite of Luther's emphasis on salvation by faith and Calvin's doctrine of predestination. But from a scientific point of view, it is virtually impossible to know whether this was primarily a cause or a consequence of the growth of the bourgeoisie and rise of commercial capitalism in Western Europe. That is the familiar scientific problem of determining the direction of causation, what in simple parlance is called the chicken or egg argument. However, even assuming, as does Weber and Virtue, that it was a cause, it is unlikely to have been such if the European bourgeoisie had not had legal protection for their property, a protection which was much enhanced by the emergence of the Renaissance absolutist states with their blessing and support. Thus, in assuming the fundamental historical question in answering the fundamental historical question as to why the Industrial Revolution did not take place in countries like Iran, I wrote in 1978 in an attempt to explain the chief reason for lack of long-term capital accumulation in Iranian history. I quote, "The landlord enjoyed no right to his title or security of his income. If European capitalist property involved an inviolable natural freedom and feudal property involved an inviolable natural right, Iranian landed income and wealth were an alienable arbitrary privilege. The same state of insecurity of income and wealth applied to merchant capital, both in the merchant's lifetime and after. Capital accumulation requires postponement of present consumption, i.e. saving, and saving necessitates a minimum degree of security and certainty concerning the future. In a country in which money itself, let alone financial and physical assets, has been under the threat of confiscation and expropriation, it is impressive that financial capital was accumulated and trade was carried out to the extent that they were. The entire course of Iranian history and the existing chronicles of its events are crowded with examples of this state of insecurity. Unquote. Long-term accumulation of capital was indeed one necessary condition for industrial development. But there were other conditions, other coincidental changes that made the emergence of modern state and society possible, not least the rise of the absolutist state in Europe, which made capitalist property freer than before from the encroachment of the old aristocratic madness. This factor both helped and was helped by the spirit of capitalism, which sought to please God by low consumption, high saving, and hard work. It might have been a commonplace if the fundamental point had not been constantly in danger of being missed about long-term development, that it is a process which marks a total transformation of the society from one state to another, and not just one which merely results in an increase in the share of industrial goods and services in the national output, or in the secularization of the law, politics, and social relations, or simply in the emergence of mass society. It is total transformations of this kind, changes which require a long and continuous process, in some cases taking a few centuries to transform the society, that seldom took place in Iran, and on a few occasions that they did for some time. The basic norms of arbitrary state and society led to their disruption, sometimes followed even by decline and retrogression, thus turning history in a series of connected short terms. Development requires not only acquisition and innovation, but also and especially accumulation and preservation, whether of wealth, of rights and privileges, or of knowledge and science. European society was a long-term society. Major change, whether the fall of feudalism, the rise of capitalism, and the emergence of the liberal state, whether the rejection of Aristotelian logics, Ptolemaic cosmography, and the Greco-Roman political thought, or the Roman Catholic hegemony, all of these took a long time and a great deal of effort and struggle to occur. But when they finally did, the change was irreversible, and a new social framework, a new law, a new science, even a new religion was established that would once again take much time and effort to change, even to reform. As noted, the long-term society makes possible long-term accumulation precisely because the law and traditions that govern it and its institutions afford a certain amount of security by making the future reasonably predictable. At the same time, and for the same reason, it makes major change in the short run very difficult. In the long-term society, revolution, whether in law, politics, or science, is a rare and extraordinary occurrence, but when it does happen, it is non-reversible and therefore has long-term effects. And that concludes my long speech.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Katuzian, for your article. And indeed, it was a groundbreaking article. It sparked a lot of debates within the Iranian society and within the community of Iranian historians working on Iran. We have plenty of questions. I think you can also see in the panel, in your Zoom panel, I think there are a few questions written in English and in Persian also. But perhaps I would like to open the floor, the panel, by asking one short question myself. And this is the phenomenon of short-term society, is it exclusive to Iran, or do you think other societies, for example, to put in how Marx said, in Asiatic societies, is it a phenomenon of Asiatic societies?
Well, I have worked on Iranian history, society, economy, etc., for now about 58 years. And therefore, I feel competent to speak about the very peculiar features and peculiarities and characteristics of such things in the case of Iran. In the case of other societies, I haven't got that kind of experience. But there may be similarities. I mean, certainly, I think in the case of some other Asiatic societies, there was the system was arbitrary, and there was no established law to control the state. But beyond that, I cannot say whether that would therefore make those societies short-term societies or not.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bashak, perhaps you would also...
I would have a question on the concept of kanun.
Concept of?
Kanun.
Kanun.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit more about the concept of the place of the concept of kanun in your theory, short-term society, and its relations with the concept of arbitrary ruler? For example, in the case of Nasreddin Shah, and he's telling succession to his son for money, for example. Was the reason the lack of kanun in modern sense in Qajar Iran? And yes.
Well, as I said, if I understood your question correctly, the problem throughout Iranian history was the fact that power was arbitrary. And this meant that the ruler or those who act on his authority can do whatever they like if they have the physical power to do it. Of course, I mean, Almighty is only one, and that's God, that can do anything he likes. But an arbitrary ruler can only do things that is within his power to do. But that is a far cry from society in which there is a legal framework, whether written or unwritten. Because, I mean, for example, absolutist rulers of France or England or Austria or wherever, they didn't have the power, as did the Shahs of Iran, to have the head of the sons cut off or their eyes blinded. And they couldn't even imagine such a thing. But in the case of arbitrary rule, all this was possible and happened, and fairly regularly, as I mentioned. I mean, in the case of ministers, of course, it's quite extraordinary. It's a long line of, there are pre-Islamic examples of that too. It's a long story. It doesn't mean that it happened only in Islamic times. But I mentioned the cases starting from 1,000 and 1,100 years ago, and given some examples. So yes, it was the Shah's arbitrary power on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that there was no objective rule for legitimacy. that is to say anybody could be ruler, could be Shah, depending on the circumstances. If Nasruddin Shah had sold the succession to his other son, well, he would have been the legitimate ruler when his father died. Or in many cases, there were rebels. Even we have cases of slaves in Iranian society. That is mainly post-Islamic, that fought their way up and became Shah. Anything like that is just absolutely unimaginable in the case of the long-term society.
Thank you. If you have a look at the chat panel, you can see a plenty of questions. For example, one is written in Persian, and also and one question, for example, what was the first cause for being a short-term society? In your opinion, whether the geography or culture of Iran was more important for the emergence of the short-term society?
You're looking for the primeval cause, the very Newtonian first cause of certain things, such as Newton said after he presented his laws of mechanics, he was told what was the role of God in it. And these things are working themselves out. What is the role of God? And he said, well, the God made this system and gave it a kick. And it started working. And then God sat back. Anyway, this is an anecdote. No, the first cause is impossible to know scientifically, because whatever theory there may be, it's untested. And scientific theories, theory can be scientific only if it's testable. But beyond that, it is possible that the aridity of the land had something to do with it. The aridity, the limited water supply. And this, in the case of Iran, was probably the reason why the villages that were formed in historic times of early history, the villages were small because of aridity and with long distances from each other. They were arid and isolated. I have an article called The Arid Isolated Society. And because of that, none of them together or a few together, none of them on its own or a few together could provide a social base for feudalism, could provide, in other words, enough surplus value beyond their own consumption and investment necessities to afford a dominion of a feudal lord. So they were entirely on their own, and feudalism could not emerge as a result of these peculiarities. But there was one other thing. There was the role of the nomads who invaded the Iranian plateau from the east, from northeast, and from northwest. And they were mobile and they were armed. So they could use their power to gather the agricultural surplus of a large territory. Instead of a few feudals doing a number of smaller territories, they could gather the agricultural surplus of a large number of the thousands of villages, and formed a state. The state that was rich, powerful, with standing armies, which it could afford to have because it had the money to have it, and so on. Very briefly, I've written extensively on that, but always admitting that this is merely a hypothesis, and it cannot certainly be perhaps not even a theory, but certainly not a scientific theory.
Thank you.
There are a few questions, one specifically written in Persian. If you could also see this, because it's a quite long question. And also there's another one in English asking, what do you think about the historical experiences of the other non-Western countries in comparison with the Western European countries? Can we say that all of the non-Western societies were short-term until the modern period? And I can also read out the Persian one if you want.
I'm not quite sure if I did get the question.
Okay, I can read it again. What do you think about the historical experience
Yes.
of the other non-Western European countries in comparison with the Western European countries?
Well, as I said earlier, I said I haven't got any competence. I am not competent in judging in any great detail, in any serious way that I hope I've done in the case of Iran, the characteristics and the social and historical characteristics of those other societies. As I said, for example, some Asian societies are likely to have had some similar features, such as, I think, something that one can say with certainty because of mere general knowledge of history, is that is arbitrary, is a lack of existence of an established legal framework to run the society, and therefore lack of established rights and obligations and so on and so forth, like European societies. I mean, China and India, for example, may be serious examples of this. But beyond that, I cannot judge. It's difficult. It's a complicated story. It took me a very long time to reach conclusions I have reached in the case of Iran.
Thanks a lot. Indeed, it takes a lot of time to work on history, and it's specifically in the case of Iran, it is very difficult. There's a question in Persian. If you don't mind, I can read it out loud if you want. I don't know for our English-speaking audience or the Turkish-speaking audience per se, how they're gonna translate this question. But it says, شما استدلال فرمودید که جامعه ایرانی یک جامعه کوتاه مدت هست. به نظر میرسه که فرمایش شما با طرز تفکر و ادبیات رایج مطالعاتی در ایران همسو نیست. اکثر محققین چه ایرانی و چه غیر ایرانی در طول تاریخ اذعان میکنن که به طور ویژه شعور ایرانیت، یعنی ایرانی بودن و تمدن ایرانی، دارای امتداد و عقبه طولانی است، یا به عبارت دیگر دراز مدت میباشد. در متون تاریخی اگرچه حکمرانی سیاسی در جغرافیای ایران مدت‌های مدیدی در دست خاندان‌های کوتنکوت غیر ایرانی بوده، اما با این همه در ضمیر ناخودآگاه جامعه این حکومت‌ها در امتداد مفهوم تمدن ایرانی تلقی می‌گردد. فرمایش شما از این منظر با طرز تفکر و ادبیات ایران شهری مغایرت جدی دارد. به عبارت دیگر در نقطه مخالف تفکر ایران شهری قرار گرفته. با تکیه بر تئوری‌های خود حضرت عالی انتقاد اساسی شما به تفکر ایران شهری چیست؟ و سوال بعدی این که آیا قصد دارید انتشار این مقالات خود را، این انتقادات خود را، آیا قصد انتشار این انتقادات خود را دارید یا نه؟ متشکرم. I don't know how they're going to translate in
عرض کنم که به فارسی بگم یا speak in English or Persian?
In English, please, because the interpreter could translate. Yeah.
Well, argument is that Iran has a long history and has had several dynasties that over the long term have been ruling the country. There is no argument against that. I have no, that is as much of a fact as what I have been saying. I have been presenting argument and evidence to you. Now, if the evidence is incorrect, tell me it is incorrect. Tell me what you said about the succession of Muhammad Shah, what you said about the threat to the life of Abbas Mirza Jr., what you said about the treatment of their sons by the Safavids, their incarceration they had, any number. I mean, I've produced massive evidence. Now, you point out to me that which one of these is incorrect, it's wrong, it's not true, it's not happened. I have made it up. That is not the case, and that is why you are telling me that I am opposed to a certain idea. I'm not opposed to any idea. I'm just presenting my own theory, and which I can defend on the basis of argument and evidence. But the fact that Iran has a long history, of course it has a long history. But it's a long history, as I explained, it's made up of short terms, connected short terms. And there is no conflict between these two matters. I described to you exactly what I meant by the short-term society. No, I didn't say short-term history. I said short-term society. And short-term society, exactly like, for example, the lack of aristocracy in Iran, which would have made up a long-term ruling class, independent from the state. We didn't have that. We had a long history, but we didn't have a long aristocracy. We didn't have, we had dynasties ruling the country, but within each dynasty, there were all sorts of parricide, fratricide, filicide, and look at the Seljuk of Iran after the death of Malik Shah. You would be, I have detailed this in my book, you would be absolutely amazed to see what happened, what chaos happened after the death of Malik Shah, and what his descendants, his nephews, his children, what they were doing to each other until one of them would emerge as the next king. I mean, in this case, particularly Sultan Muhammad, who I mentioned, sold his wazir to another important person. That is what makes it short term, not the fact that there was a Seljuk dynasty that ruled in Iran over 200 centuries, 200 years, 2 centuries.
Thanks a lot. These are questions that I'm directing to you. And there's one more question in Turkish that some people have criticized this theory. I'm trying to summarize the question, that they have criticized you, that you argue that this is the fate, being a short-term society is the fate of the Iranian, is the destiny of the Iranian society. But I think you've mentioned that this is your hypothesis, and I don't know if you want to answer the question.
May I add something, Alireza? And there is one question in English. It's also about the contemporary Iran and the future of Iran. So maybe we can combine these questions and ask your predictions for the future. Do you think is it the country's fate to be a short-term society?
What can be forced? Can be forced to be a short-term society?
Yes, for the future.
Future?
Yeah, for the future. For example, there is one.
I have no idea. I'm not a what's you call it? Prophet. I can predict scientifically, but I cannot foresee the future like prophets. Prophecy was quite rife in Europe in late 19th century, especially by people like Marx and others, who Hegel, who prophesied till the end of day, until the day of judgment. They prophesied what would happen. This would happen, that would happen, that would, this society, that revolution, after that revolution, this, all that. That's prophecy. That's not scientific prediction. And that's where they went wrong. And history proved them wrong. I can't prophesy. I can't prophesy. I can only predict. So I don't know. It all depends a great deal on what happens to society and state. It all depends a great deal about the acquisition of the proper experience, the appropriate experience by the society of behaving in such a way that would change the rules of behavior. But how this would happen, how the society would do that or could do that, I cannot tell.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any more questions from our audience, perhaps from the live stream on YouTube or from the attendees here on Zoom? It seems that there's no question. Thanks a lot, Dr. Katouzyan, for attending today's special event. It was an honor to host you here. And Başak, if you have anything to...
Thank you very much for attending. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you and a pleasure to have presented this talk to you and your audience. And I look forward to seeing Başak fairly soon in Oxford.
I hope so. I hope so. Okay, thank you very much for attending us, for joining us in this talk. And that is
what was the question?
Of course, there's no question so far.
No,
So
no
ask the questions. I would like to thank Dr. Katouzyan, Başak, and others that joined us today, and wish a good evening and a good weekend for our audience. Have a good day and see you next. Sorry?
If you were a Christian society, I would have said, enjoy the weekend. but then I'm not enjoying it, even though I live in it. I enjoy it. I'm not enjoying it in the other sense. I'm not putting my feet up on Saturday. I normally work.
Do we? But this is.
I normally work during weekends. Saturdays and Sundays.
Same with us. So still, it's a work day, but some people like to call it off day. So to respect those.
And goodbye.
Thank you for joining, and thank you, Başak.
Thank you.
Have a good day, good evening to our audience.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.